Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Mongolian Meatloaf. That's right, I couldn't decide whether to make Mongolian beef or make a meatloaf, so I decided to try both things at once. And I could not have been more pleased with how this experiment turned out. And no, for the record, none of this is even remotely Mongolian, and we'll get into that later. But for now, let's go ahead and get started by sauteing some onions in some vegetable oil, along with a big pinch of salt, in a pan set over medium-high heat, and we will cook those stirring for a few minutes, or until the onions start to soften up and turn translucent, and maybe start to take on a little bit of golden brown color. And once we feel like that's happened, and our onions are looking a little something like this, we will stop and add some crushed or finely minced garlic, along with some finely grated ginger, and we'll go ahead and stir that in, and then cook this for just about a minute, just to take the raw edge off those two aromatics. And believe it or not, that's it. Once that's cooked for about a minute, we will turn off the heat, at which point we need to let this cool down to room temp before we add it to the next ingredient. And that would be a couple pounds of ground beef, which ideally is 85% lean, 15% fat. But if you have to, I think 90-10 will also work. But either way, we'll go ahead and add our onion mixture, followed by our starchy filler, which for most meatloafs is going to be breadcrumbs. But since this is inspired by Mongolian beef, I'm going to go with a cup of cooked rice, which I've always thought was an excellent and very underrated substitute for breadcrumbs in meatloaf. And then after the rice, we'll also want to add 1 beaten egg. And then we will follow that with some freshly sliced green onions, which, unlike the harsher, harder yellow onions we diced up, do not need to be cooked first before adding to this mixture. So we'll toss those in before we season this up with a little bit of soy sauce, plus some kosher salt. And because our sauce is going to be fairly salty, we are going to use a relatively light hand here. And that's it. We'll finish up with some freshly ground black pepper. And then we'll go ahead and mix this all together, which I like to use a fork for, which might take a few extra minutes. But I feel it's a nice way to combine this without having to worry too much about overmixing, which can make a meatloaf a little bit tough and rubbery. Although having said that, that's not going to be so much of a problem for this recipe, since again it's inspired by Mongolian beef, which is done with strips of beef, which definitely has a little bit of texture and chew to it. So for this, a meatloaf that's actually a little bit firmer and not super tender and crumbly is probably a better choice. But anyway, the main point here is mix this until everything is evenly combined, at which point we'll take this and transfer it into a lightly oiled loaf pan. And then to ensure a nice uniform shape once this is baked, we will want to make sure we're pressing that meat down firmly into the corners so that we don't leave any pockets of air. And then once everything's been thoughtfully pressed in, we'll go ahead and smooth out the top, at which point this is ready to transfer into the center of a 350-degree oven for about an hour, or until we have an internal temp of about 145 to 150, at which point our meatloaf should look like this. And no, that is not the most beautiful thing that's ever come out of our oven. But don't worry, the final presentation is going to be stunning. And if we wanted, we could just slice and serve this meatloaf hot, topped with the Mongolian beef sauce we're just about to make. But I prefer to serve this what I call diner style, which means we cook it ahead, chill it, and then slice and brown a piece when we're ready to serve. So once that had cooled down, I wrapped it up and popped it in the fridge. But whether you're going to serve yours hot right away, or do it what I call diner style, we still need to make our Mongolian beef sauce, which is going to start with a little bit of oil in a cold pan, into which we will add some grated ginger, as well as some finely minced or crushed garlic, and then we'll turn our heat on to medium-high, and we will wait until we see and hear that stuff start to sizzle, at which point we'll give it a little bit of a stir fry for about 30 seconds, although it's really more of a smash and smear fry. But anyway, we'll give that a quick sizzle before we add in the rest of the ingredients, which includes a little touch of brown sugar, plus the other main ingredient, some soy sauce. And even though I didn't, it's probably not a bad idea to use low-sodium soy sauce, since we can always adjust with salt later, and that's a safer bet. But either way, we'll finish this up with some chili flakes, as well as a little touch of ketchup, which is my secret ingredient. And then last but not least, a splash of cold fresh water. And what we'll do is give that a whisk, and wait for it to start to simmer, at which point our sauce is basically done. Okay, we don't want to continue cooking and reducing this, because it will get way too intense and salty. So once this does start to bubble, we can go ahead and turn our heat down to low, since as I just said, our sauce is basically done, except at this point, the texture is a little too thin, which is why our final step will be to thicken this up with a cornstarch slurry, which is nothing more than a teaspoon of cornstarch that we dissolve in a couple teaspoons of water. Oh, and if you can, try to get all the cornstarch in the cup. But anyway, we'll stir that together and then pour it into our sauce. And we can just use that same spoon we stirred it with to mix that in. But then we should probably switch to a whisk. And we'll raise our temperature up to medium-high. And as soon as this mixture just starts to simmer again, you will notice the sauce start to thicken up and get shiny. And if everything goes according to plan, we should end up with something that looks like this. Okay, we don't want something super thick. All right, we're not trying to make Mongolian beef pudding, which is what you will get if you add too much cornstarch. Okay, we just want something that beautifully coats our meat. And to me, this was looking just about perfect. And that's it. We'll simply keep that warm until we're ready to serve. And yes, you can make this ahead and warm it up. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and take out our cold meatloaf, and we will remove that from the pan. Oh, and if it's sticking, that's because of the cold fat. Just warm up the bottom a little bit and it will slide right out. And then what we'll do is cut this in half so we can see the inside. And no, the inside does not look much better than the outside. But that's okay, since what we're going to do after slicing off a portion is heat this up by browning it in a pan. And for this test slice, I decided to dust the surface with cornstarch before browning, since as you may know, when we do Mongolian beef, the strips of steak are dusted in cornstarch first, before they're pan-fried to give them nice crusty edges. So I thought that would be appropriate to try here. But anyway, once dusted, I heated up some oil in a nonstick pan set over medium-high heat, and I placed my slice of what will hopefully soon be Mongolian meatloaf in. And as soon as the surface is browned to our liking, and of course our meatloaf is heated through, we'll be ready to serve this up and top it with our sauce. And while we could definitely reheat this meatloaf without the cornstarch, it probably does help produce a nicer crust. Which reminds me, when you turn that over, please let the other side get just as browned and crusty. Which I didn't, because I was in a hurry and starving, and I really wanted to try this with the sauce to see if this experiment was even going to work. But anyway, I plated that up, drooling with anticipation as I did, and then I went ahead and spooned over that gorgeous Mongolian beef sauce, which, believe it or not, was adapted from a copycat P.F. Chang recipe that I came across about 10 years ago. So I spooned that over before finishing up with a few toasted sesame seeds, and then I grabbed a fork and went in for a taste. And that, my friends, was exactly how I hoped it was going to be. Okay, instead of a thin strip of pan-fried beef, this amazingly flavorful sauce was coating a nice tender beefy piece of meatloaf, and it only took me a couple bites to realize that for a change, I had actually accomplished what I'd set out to do, which was a meatloaf that actually tasted like Mongolian beef. Oh, and this would be a great time to mention that not only does this have nothing to do with Mongolian cuisine, neither does Mongolian beef. All right, apparently that's a dish popularized in American Chinese restaurants by way of Taiwan. So I did want to mention that, in case any of our Mongolian friends are watching, since they're probably a little bit confused why I keep calling this Mongolian. But anyway, I was beyond thrilled with this test piece. So after I finished that, I browned up another slice and served it properly this time on some bok choy rice, which is simply steamed rice with a whole bunch of bok choy in it. And after topping that with plenty of our sauce, I again finished up with some toasted sesame seeds for some dramatic visual contrast, as well as a few shakes of chili flakes for a little bit of heat and a touch of color. Oh, and if you wanted to top this with other things like sliced green onions or a fresh herb like cilantro, go ahead. I mean, you are, after all, the Genghis Khan of what else should go on. But what you see here is my official plating recommendation. And as incredible as this was eaten by itself, it was even more extraordinary on top of the rice, eaten along with those slightly bitter greens, since, as you may know, a little bit of bitterness in a dish really does amplify all the other flavors, and also provides a perfect contrast and a perfect balance to that sweet saltiness of the sauce. And even though our beef was in meatloaf form, if you like classic Mongolian beef, I think you're going to absolutely love this. And by the way, the most common complaint about Mongolian beef is usually that the meat's too tough, and or pan-frying all those little strips of meat was too messy and time-consuming. Well, here we've eliminated both those issues. So if those are some problems you've had and don't want to deal with, or you're just interested in something extraordinarily delicious to eat, then I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.